There is a version of this history that most people carry around without examining it too closely. The German soldier of World War II as a single archetype, gray uniform, coal scuttle helmet, stoic expression, an undifferentiated mass of military threat moving across a map. It is a useful shorthand for films and documentaries, and it is almost entirely wrong. The German military of World War II was not a monolith. It was a layered, fractured, internally competitive ecosystem of distinct infantry types, each with its own command structure, its own doctrine, its own equipment priorities, its own culture, and in many cases its own bitter institutional rivalries with the others. Understanding the difference between these formations is not a matter of technical detail for enthusiasts. Now, it is the key to understanding why the Wehrmacht fought the way it did, why it succeeded where it succeeded, and why it collapsed the way it collapsed. Because the story of German infantry in World War II is not one story, it is at least 7, and each of them ends differently. 1. The Heer Infantry, the professional corps. That won the early war start here, because everything else is built in relation to this foundation. The Heer, the German army proper, provided the bulk of German ground combat power throughout the entire war. At its peak, in 1941, the Heer fielded over 3 million men organized into infantry divisions, panzer divisions, motorized infantry, and mountain troops. These were, at the outbreak of the war, among the most thoroughly trained and doctrinally sophisticated soldiers on the planet. The foundation of Heer infantry effectiveness was not equipment, though German equipment was competitive. It was the command philosophy discussed in every serious analysis of German military power, Auftragstactik, or mission-based tactics. Heer infantry commanders at every level, from division generals down to squad leaders, were trained to understand the objective and make independent decisions about how to achieve it. Initiative was not just permitted, it was expected, required. A sergeant who waited for explicit instructions when the tactical situation demanded immediate action was failing his duty. This produced a combat effectiveness that consistently punched above its numerical weight. In Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, in the opening months of Barbarossa in 1941, Heer infantry divisions achieved results that opposing commanders described as operationally impossible. They moved faster than the enemy's command cycle could respond to. By the time a defensive adjustment had been ordered, the situation it was designed to address had already changed twice. The equipment that distinguished Heer infantry squads was built around this aggressive doctrine. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 machine gun were not support weapons in the Allied sense, supplementary firepower attached to a rifle-armed squad. They were the centerpiece of the tactical unit, around which everything else was organized. The MG-42's cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, compared to the American Browning's 550, was not just a statistical difference. It was a fundamentally different philosophy of what a machine gun was supposed to do. Suppress was not the objective. Destroy was. But the Heer infantry that conquered Western Europe in 1940 was not the Heer infantry that was fighting in Stalingrad in 1942, or defending Normandy in 1944, or collapsing back toward Berlin in 1945. The professional corps was consumed by attrition, particularly on the Eastern Front, at a rate that German manpower reserves could not sustain. By the final year of the war, Heer infantry divisions that had entered the conflict with 9,000 men at near full equipment were fielding 3,000, sometimes fewer, with weapons drawn from half a dozen different occupied nations and soldiers whose training measured in weeks rather than years. The Heer that ended the war was wearing the same uniform as the Heer that started it. It was a different army entirely. 2. The Waffen-SS, political soldiers who became military elites. The Waffen-SS occupies a position in the history of German infantry that is simultaneously well documented and persistently misunderstood, usually in both directions at once. The organization began as a political and ideological formation, the armed wing of the SS, Heinrich Himmler's racial and security empire. Its original purpose was internal, the enforcement of Nazi party power, the protection of senior leadership, the demonstration in steel and blood that ideological commitment could be converted into military capability. Its early commanders were selected for political reliability, not tactical competence. By 1942, any of that had changed substantially. Not because the ideological character of the Waffen-SS had softened, it had not, but because the operational demands of a war the Reich was increasingly struggling to win had forced a professionalization that Himmler's original vision had not anticipated. The premier Waffen-SS divisions, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Wiking, received priority allocation of Germany's best equipment. The Tiger tank appeared in Waffen-SS panzer units before it reached comparable Heer formations. Replacement soldiers were drawn from the physically and politically screened top tier of available manpower, and crucially, the combat experience accumulated in the brutal Eastern Front fighting from 1941 onward produced a corps of junior and mid-level commanders whose tactical competence was, by any objective measure, exceptional. German commanders who worked with premier Waffen-SS formations in combined operations frequently noted their offensive aggression, their willingness to accept casualties to achieve objectives, and their tactical flexibility at the squad and platoon level. Opponents noted the same things from the other side of the experience. If this channel's approach, peeling back the institutional layer to understand why military formations behaved the way they did, is landing for you, hit the like button. Because what we're doing here is the level of analysis most sources either can't reach or won't commit to. But the Waffen-SS story has a layer that purely military analysis tends to skip, and skipping it produces an incomplete picture. Now, the same formations whose tactical performance at Kharkov in 1943 represented some of the most operationally sophisticated armored infantry fighting of the entire war were also the formations whose members were responsible for documented atrocities in France, in the Soviet Union, and in the Ardennes. The Malmedy Massacre, the execution of approximately 84 American prisoners of war in December of 1944, was carried out by soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte. The Waffen-SS was not a conventional military organization that happened to wear a different uniform. It was an ideological instrument that happened to develop genuine military capability. Understanding it requires holding both of those facts simultaneously. Because separating them produces a picture that is either a war crime chronicle with no tactical context or a military analysis with a significant moral blind spot. 3. Fallschirmjäger, the brief, brilliant age of the German paratrooper. In May of 1940, the German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers conducted an operation that the military establishments of every major power on Earth spent the following months analyzing in detail. The assault on the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, considered one of the most formidable defensive installations in Europe, designed to hold for weeks against a conventional ground assault, was neutralized in approximately 18 hours by a force of 78 German paratroopers landing directly on its roof. The combination of surprise, shaped explosive charges, and the specific tactical training of the assault force rendered months of Belgian defensive preparation irrelevant before breakfast. The Fallschirmjäger of 1940 were a genuinely elite formation built around a specific set of capabilities. The ability to deploy rapidly behind enemy lines, operate independently without immediate resupply or reinforcement, and achieve tactical effects disproportionate to their numbers. Selection was rigorous, training was physically demanding and tactically sophisticated. The institutional culture emphasized individual capability and small unit autonomy at a level that exceeded even the Heer's Auftragstaktik standard. The Crete operation in May of 1941 was both the high watermark and the effective end of German offensive airborne operations. When the Fallschirmjäger took Crete, a significant achievement against a well-defended island with substantial Allied garrison forces, but at a cost that shocked even Hitler. Over 6,000 paratroopers killed, missing, or wounded. Transport aircraft losses that the Luftwaffe could not easily replace. And the tactical lesson that parachute infantry, landing under fire, was extraordinarily vulnerable in the moments between exit from the aircraft and consolidation on the ground. Hitler personally concluded that the age of large-scale airborne assault was over. Future Fallschirmjäger operations would be primarily ground combat, elite infantry assigned to the most critical defensive positions rather than offensive vertical envelopments, save this one. Not the arc of the Fallschirmjäger, from Eben-Emael to the defensive battles of Monte Cassino and the Ardennes, is one of the most instructive stories in military history about how a capability optimized for a specific operational context performs when that context disappears. You will want this reference. The Fallschirmjäger proved the point emphatically at Monte Cassino in 1944, where the 1st Parachute Division held a defensive position against sustained Allied assault for 4 months. Their performance as ground infantry was exceptional, but they were exceptional ground infantry holding ground, not the vertical strike force that had defined the formation's original purpose. The transformation was complete, and the cost of achieving it had been created. 4. Gebirgsjäger, the mountain soldiers. There is a category of infantry whose operational value is entirely invisible until the terrain requires it, and then becomes irreplaceable. The German Gebirgsjäger, or mountain troops, were that category. Recruited primarily from alpine regions of Germany and Austria, trained specifically for combat in high altitude and severe terrain, equipped with specialized gear for operations in conditions that would render conventional infantry units non-functional within days. Their tactical doctrine was built around small unit independence. Because in mountain terrain, communication with higher command is unreliable, resupply is measured in what can be carried on a man's back, and the ability to make correct tactical decisions without external guidance is not a preference, but a survival requirement. The Gebirgsjäger's most famous moment came not in a mountain range but on a peak. In August of 1942, soldiers of the 1st Mountain Division climbed Mount Elbrus, the highest point in the Caucasus and in Europe, and planted the German war flag at its summit at an altitude of 5,642 meters. It was a propaganda triumph and an operational irrelevance simultaneously. In the Caucasus campaign, in Norway, in the brutal terrain of northern Finland and the Greek mountains, Gebirgsjäger units achieved results that conventional infantry divisions assigned to the same terrain could not replicate. Their ability to maintain operational capability in conditions, altitude, cold, terrain gradient, high supply isolation, that degraded or destroyed conventional unit effectiveness, made them a disproportionately valuable asset in specific operational contexts. The limitation was the mirror image of the capability. Gebirgsjäger trained for mountain warfare were not optimized for the flat, attritional, industrial-scale combat of the Eastern Front's central sectors. They could be deployed there, and were, as German manpower pressures mounted, but deploying specialized mountain infantry in terrain that negated their specific advantages was a symptom of the broader German manpower crisis that would define the final 2 years of the war. 5 Wartime Panzer Grenadiers. The infantry the tank required. The development of Panzer Grenadier formations represents one of the most important doctrinal evolutions in German infantry thinking, and one of the most consequential gaps between German theory and German practice. The fundamental tactical lesson of armored warfare, which German operational analysis identified early and clearly, was that tanks without infantry support were vulnerable to well-organized infantry defense. Armor could break through a line, could exploit a gap, could create operational depth, but it could not hold terrain against determined infantry counterattack operating in close country. The solution was infantry that could keep pace with armor operationally, mounted in armored half-tracks, trained in combined arms tactics, equipped and doctrinally prepared to operate as an integrated system with panzer formations. The Panzer Grenadier, fully realized, was one of the most tactically sophisticated infantry types of the entire war. The armored half-track, the SDKFZ 251, provided battlefield mobility, protection from small arms and artillery fragments, and a mobile weapons platform that could bring direct fire to support dismounted infantry assault. A Panzer Grenadier battalion, working in close coordination with a panzer regiment, was capable of operational tempo that pure infantry or pure armor could not match. The gap between the doctrine and the operational reality was supply. Germany never produced sufficient armored half-tracks to mount more than a fraction of its Panzer Grenadier formations in the vehicles the doctrine required. For every fully mechanized Panzer Grenadier regiment equipped to the doctrinal standard, there were several more designated Panzer Grenadier on the order of battle, but moving on foot or in requisitioned trucks. The distinction mattered enormously in high-tempo operations, where the ability to keep pace with armor was the point. By the later war, as German industrial production was progressively disrupted by Allied bombing and material shortages mounted, the gap between the Panzer Grenadier concept and the Panzer Grenadier reality widened further. The doctrine survived. The resources to implement it did not. 6. Volksgrenadier. The army at the bottom of the barrel. By the autumn of 1944, The German Wehrmacht had been consuming manpower on the Eastern Front for over 3 years. The Professional Corps of 1939, the career soldiers, the trained NCO Corps, the officers who had developed their tactical instincts through years of preparation and 2 years of combat, was largely gone. Killed, captured, wounded beyond return to service, or dispersed through formations so degraded they barely functioned. Into this gap came the Volksgrenadier, People's Infantry, a formation type, created in the summer of 1944 by a Wehrmacht high command that was simultaneously trying to rebuild shattered divisions and conscript from a manpower pool that had already been drawn down to margins that would have been considered unacceptable 2 years earlier. Volksgrenadier divisions were built around a reduced organizational structure, fewer men per division than standard Heer formations, compensated theoretically by a higher proportion of automatic weapons, where a standard Heer Infantry division might rely on bolt-action rifles for the majority of its riflemen. Volksgrenadier units received higher allocations of the Sturmgewehr, 44 assault rifle, and the Volkssturmgewehr, weapons designed to provide firepower density with reduced training requirements. The theory was sound. The manpower filling these formations was not. Volksgrenadier divisions drew from men previously classified as unfit for service, older men, men with medical conditions that had previously disqualified them, men transferred from the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine as those services shrank, teenage boys whose training had been measured in weeks. They were issued weapons more advanced than those carried by their predecessors in 1940 and sent against an enemy that had been fighting and learning and adapting for 5 years. The channel that laid out the 10 fatal mistakes that doomed Germany, and now this, is building towards something. Subscribe now, because the next layer of this history is where everything we have established starts connecting into a picture that most accounts of World War II never fully assemble. Their performance was, given the circumstances, sometimes remarkable. During the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive gamble in December of 1944, certain Volksgrenadier formations fought with a determination that surprised Allied commanders expecting an easy advance. But the gap between will and capability is a fixed operational reality, and no amount of National Socialist ideological commitment converted 6 weeks of training into the tactical proficiency that the Eastern Front's surviving veterans had accumulated over years. The Volksgrenadier was not a solution to the German manpower crisis. It was the visible shape of a crisis that had no solution. 7. Volkssturm, the last desperate measure, and then at the end, there was the Volkssturm. Decreed by Hitler on September 25, 1944, the Volkssturm was not, strictly speaking, a military formation at all. It was a national militia, a conscription of every male German between the ages of 16 and 60 who was not already serving in the armed forces, organized under Nazi Party rather than Wehrmacht command, equipped with whatever weapons remained available, trained for a matter of days or weeks, and deployed to defend German territory against Allied forces that were, by late 1944, approaching from both east and west. The weapons issued to Volkssturm units illustrated the material reality of the Reich in its final months more clearly than any statistical summary. The Panzerfaust, a disposable anti-tank rocket launcher cheap enough to mass-produce in large numbers, became the Volkssturm's primary anti-armor weapon, and in many cases, its primary weapon of any kind. Boys of 16 were trained in its use in an afternoon and positioned to face Soviet armor that had absorbed 4 years of German anti-tank fire and kept coming. The gap between the Volkssturm's designated operational purpose and its actual capability was total. These were not soldiers who had been inadequately trained. They were civilians who had been handed weapons and told that the survival of Germany depended on their willingness to die in place. Some fought, some scattered when contact was made. Many were killed in engagements that professional soldiers on either side would have recognized as unwinnable before the first shot was fired. What the Volkssturm represents in this history, something worth stating plainly, because most accounts treat it as a footnote rather than a conclusion. The Volkssturm was the final expression of the same pattern that had produced every other failure cataloged in this account. The belief, sustained past every point where evidence demanded its revision, that will could substitute for capability, that ideological commitment could offset material reality, and that the gap between what was required and what was available could be bridged by determination alone. It could not. It never could. and the boys in Volkssturm armbands standing in the path of the Soviet advance in the spring of 1945 were the human cost of that final, sustained refusal to acknowledge what the evidence had been saying for years. Here is what every formation in this account, from the professional Heer divisions of 1939 to the Volkssturm teenagers of 1945, ultimately demonstrates when you lay them against each other. Military capability is not a fixed property. It is a product of time, resources, doctrine, and institutional investment, and it degrades under pressure faster than it can be rebuilt. Germany began the war with one of the finest infantry forces in modern military history and ended it feeding children into a catastrophe. The distance between those 2 points was not inevitable. It was the accumulated product of decisions, each of which made sense within the logic of the moment and collectively produced a trajectory that could not be reversed. What do you think was the single most significant transition point? The moment where German infantry capability crossed from recoverable to irreversible decline? Put your argument in the comments. There are people reading this thread who have been studying this question for years, and the debate that follows is going to be worth having. 7 types of infantry, 7 distinct stories with 7 distinct trajectories, all operating simultaneously inside the same war, under the same flag, serving the same catastrophically flawed strategic vision. The Heer professional, consumed by attrition, it was never designed to sustain. The Waffen-SS ideological instrument that developed genuine military capability and deployed it in service of genuine atrocity. The Fallschirmjäger vertical strike force converted into ground infantry after its defining capability proved too costly to sustain. The Gebirgsjäger specialist deployed increasingly outside the terrain that justified its existence. The Panzer Grenadier doctrine perpetually outrunning the industrial capacity to implement it. The Volksgrenadier formation type, built on the premise that weapons could substitute for training. The Volkssturm civilian conscript handed a Panzerfaust and a prayer. The question this leaves open, genuinely open, not rhetorically, is what this ecosystem tells us about the relationship between institutional design and institutional collapse. Each of these formations was created to solve a real problem. Each of them solved it within limits for a period of time. And each of them was eventually asked to operate beyond those limits by a command structure that had decided the war's outcome before the war was over and spent the next 5 years paying for that assumption. That story does not belong only to 1945 Germany, and that is precisely why it is not finished being told.